Good afternoon. I'll do a self-introduction so I won't risk Will's. My name is Todd Woosley, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak here at the Good Roads Association's meeting. And I really appreciate what the Good Roads Association has done from its beginning to now to focus on the critical needs of our state transportation system, to maintain and preserve it, as well as to increase the funding to expand it. The great work, the 18th Amendment is a remarkable tool and one that you should be very, very proud of and one that you should fight like heck to maintain. I've been asked to come speak about real estate development and utilization and what the heck that has to do with transportation and specifically maintenance and preservation of our systems. So I'd like to give you just a quick background into my history, my work history, as well as my involvement in transportation policies. I've been involved in real estate development and property management for nearly 40 years now. I got my real estate license when I was 19. I'm 58. My dad moved here after selling a ranch in Wyoming, and we built some buildings, and they were designed to take advantage of some new streets that were being built in Bellevue, Washington. He had the foresight to see what was planned and understand that that was going to accommodate the growth that was coming. And then he, on the private sector side, helped build the buildings to house the businesses and the employees and provide the goods and services that people traveling on these roads would utilize. Subsequent to that, I worked with one of the state's largest home building companies, one of the country's largest commercial office developers, and focused on helping private sector real estate get through the development process, but also focusing on making sure that there's adequate investment in our transportation infrastructure to serve that. And that's a requirement under our State's Growth Management Act. We have to accommodate growth. It's going to come. It's been coming, and it will continue to come. A lot of the focus has been on making sure we have new capacity come somewhat concurrent with the development the private sector provides to meet the demands for it. But now what we've done is we've identified that we've had a failure not to only chronically underfund new capacity, but to underfund the maintenance and preservation of what we have. This morning we heard for some great historical perspective that there was this massive federal investment made into it, and it was all new, so you don't really have to plan right then. You have to spend money on maintaining and preserving it. But what we did is we failed to plan for maintaining and preserving it once that became a bigger part of the budget and there's needs for it. We certainly need to do that, and we need to call for it. Somebody said it's not the sexy stuff, and you're absolutely right. Maybe we should have ribbon cuttings for chip seals and patching up a pothole. I think that the citizens understand we need this. I think that's one of the takeaways of 976's passage. Here in the Puget Sound area, I think I'm pretty sure it was revolt against Sound Transit's excesses. I can be candid, I don't work for the public sector, but I do work towards making sure we get better infrastructure investments and more of them. I fully believe we need $100 billion more invested. I don't think light rail is the best use of those funds. I think it should go to the state and local road systems instead. But then the question came up, why did other cities, 60-some cities around the area, or the state, also vote strongly in favor of 976 when it sure looks like, either you're cutting off your nose to spite your face or you're shooting yourself in the foot, right? I've lived in those kind of jurisdictions. I've traveled to them. I've talked to a lot of folks that are involved in policy there. I think one of the takeaways is that we shouldn't have to go for extra taxes, particularly those that aren't voted on, to fund the basics of local government. I mean, filling potholes shouldn't be something that you get an extra tax for. Filling potholes should be one of the first things you do, along with providing police and fire protection, making sure your water's clean. Then if you want additional tax resources from the citizens, maybe a new park or something, that's more appropriate to ask for additional revenues. But the basics, I think, ought to be taken care of. And I think this is a bit of a revolt about, doing the fun stuff, the sexy stuff, but not taking care of basics first. And I hope you consider that as part of the post-mortem. But most importantly is how to move forward. Those of us that required to maintain properties in the private sector kind of scratch our heads at the way we do it publicly, because it doesn't seem like anybody's absolutely accountable for it or responsible for it, whereas in our case, we are. For example, and this is what I'd like to transition into, a private sector example, as well as a couple of local examples of successful funding measures for maintenance and preservation of systems that needed it. We have one property that has 4 buildings in it, and we know that every 20 years we've got to replace a roof, right? If we don't replace that roof, it's going to leak and we're going to get dry rot, and then we'll never be able to make money on those buildings again because it's going to be too damn expensive to replace dry rot and stuff. So we set aside capital reserve account, and it's untouchable. I mean, we have to have the discipline. I mean, it's there. We could use it. We don't even have to have other legislators approve, tapping into that. But we exhibit, the responsibility, the adult behavior, that money goes for this, and we know it has to go there, and we accept that fiduciary responsibility, a trust responsibility, as it were, to do that. And so these pots of money, we just put 1/20th of the known cost of replacement in every year, and every 5 years we replace a roof on the buildings, and we just go around like this, and there's no problem. Honestly, this is something we should expect and demand of our elected officials, because it's pretty basic, it's pretty fundamental, and it's what ought to be done. But as we know, and as witnessed by the huge deficit that the Good Roads Association has identified, and just taking care of what we already have first before we get into all these big investments that we're hoping that the Center House package will succeed in, and also a regional program as well, and some federal and local funds to build what we need to accommodate the growth, as well as take care of it. I just want to finish up on sharing a couple of efforts that I've been involved in. Part of this was through Chambers of Commerce, and part of it was as a former vice chair of the Bellevue Transportation Commission. I had the pleasure of serving on that with Vic. In Kirkland, they recognized that they were approaching that sweet spot in the curve on maintenance and preservation, where if they didn't start taking care of things, it was going to get really expensive. They did something at the time that was unique in the state. They went to the voters with a program to ask them to raise their taxes to fund maintenance and preservation exclusively. And they made a very good case that now is the time to do it. And if they did it, they could keep things at a good level that met the community standards. Every other package like this that had gone out beforehand had some sort of sweetener. It had a capital, goodie in it. And most people say, yeah, I want the new project. I want the roundabout or the sidewalks or the signal or whatever it was. And Kirkland took a pretty bold approach. By the way, those kind of ballot measures for local things passed, and largely because the need was there, but there was a sweetener in it. And it also demonstrates people are willing to go bigger if they think that there's a greater combined value of this. But Kirkland made a very, very good case in presentation and a video on it, et cetera, that there was just, it was worthwhile just to increase taxes to fund maintenance and preservation. And it passed pretty handily there. So I share that as a success story as to how to address it at the local level, and commend you to looking at that example that was several years ago now. More recently, in the city of Bellevue, we had a problem because in the recession, as every other jurisdiction had, revenues had declined. And part of the cuts that were made were in the city's maintenance and preservation of the transportation infrastructure. Growing demand on the system, growing demand for multimodal approaches to things. We talked about the compliance for environmental and ADA and stuff, and so the cost of doing everything was getting more expensive. These ramp replacements, right, you just did it according to their standards, and then they changed the standards, and you got to do it again, and all of that. But the long story short is what the city did is they put together a transportation levy, a property tax increase to the voters that would fund, amongst 6 particular line items of transportation, additional maintenance and preservation. So we would do overlays, bring it back to the standard that we had before and keep the streets. In other words, they didn't quite get us back to the incredible high standard that we used to have, but we just sort of couldn't necessarily afford that, but it keeps it in good condition. There's another component of that property tax vote that was for safety specifically, and this was stuff where retaining walls were falling in and things like that. That was separated out and called out in addition to routine maintenance and preservation. So I just wanted to share those stories there and leave it with this. You've heard of the broken windows syndrome? Who's familiar with this, right? If you get a broken window, you go fix it. And if you don't fix it, then all of a sudden you're going to have 6 broken windows and everything goes up. So maintenance and preservation in terms of real estate utilization, which is really people coming and going to buildings for whatever they want or need, has kind of a similar phenomenon. I asked the question about Spokane earlier about the potholes issue. We look for jurisdictions where we're going to invest in real estate, and if they have a good infrastructure that's well maintained, it's a much easier investment decision to make. But if it's not, so you sort of have, it's a virtuous cycle where if you have these investments, then you get the additional investments that then pay for those, and it spirals upward. It's just sort of a creation of wealth. And jurisdictions that take this approach combined with economic development work and working closely together to understand you're either going to spiral up or rather than a virtuous cycle of continuous improvement, you're going to go the other way and spiral down. And how many jurisdictions have we seen where they don't make these investments until it's too late? And then, of course, nobody else wants to come because all the windows are broken. So I'm going to conclude before I open up for questions. As I tell people, I'm fiscally conservative, but I'm not cheap. I just read a report where congestion, for example, is costing each of us over $1,400 a year. Vic pointed out we pay about $1 a day, $360 a year for gas tax. I pay more than that in taxes for the King County library system. And we have a fabulous library system in King County, but we have the road system needs a lot of investments. So I think that it's worth making the case. We have a fabulous case of maintaining and preserving our roads is essential, and it also then would build the trust in the citizens and in the voters to make the additional and significant investments in the kind of capacity that would lead to the economic development that generates not only the quality of life that we enjoy but want to enjoy, but the direct tax revenues that would go to pay for those investments. And there's a great return on it. So I just want to share that perspective from a real estate standpoint with property management, development, and really, frankly, it's representing the private sector that use these roads that are so essential to us being able to get around, do what we need and want to do. So with that, I'm going to thank you and I'm open to questions.
I'd like to start with a question, and I hope we have more. Todd, I've always viewed you as being quite sophisticated for a Cornell graduate, and the question I have...
It's a low bar.
The question I have is, do most realtors, or does the real estate industry understand the centrality of the road system for their business, for multimodal transportation, for economic development, for everything else that it actually supports?
Well, I think that the real estate community, particularly the development community, understands it better than the general population, particularly with the passage of the Growth Management Act, where concurrency requirements were there, but it actually goes before that. It goes when the State Environmental Policy Act was implemented to require mitigation for the trip generation from new development. And I was stunned, by having to take 6 or even 7-figure checks into a jurisdiction to pay for a new road to handle the trips that were there. I was also disappointed that we would have to, that cost was essentially borne by the people that bought the new houses in the neighborhood, and may or may not have been reimbursed, but it was a greater public good, that the local governments were not stepping up to their share of the cost of that new infrastructure. So that was the first indication that there's a big transition going on where governments used to take care of things and build it in advance of the demand. It became growth paying for growth, but then the city wasn't keeping up, or the county wasn't keeping up, or the state is exempt from concurrency. They don't even obligate themselves to doing their part of accommodating the general growth in trips. And so we're in world of hurt. That indicates that we have a much lower investment than we really ought to have, and a percentage of who pays for it. The other thing that's happening, and this is a little disappointing to me, is that there's a certain group of developers that understand that, we all understand that you have to have enough economic incentive to redevelop property to accommodate growth. And unfortunately, there hasn't been just a basic acceptance and support of those economic realities. So how do you get the regulations to allow you to do something that's economically viable, redevelopment? You have to have greater zoning, higher densities and floor area ratios. Well, you play the support of the transit industrial complex game. You come in and say, well, the only way I can get, or the best way I can get those improved regulatory climate is to support transit-oriented development. And the big developers say, well, I'm going to play that game. And so the motivation in TOD is largely to increase the ridership on rail, at the light rail stations. The zoning is done, it's the right thing to do, the up zones, for the wrong reason. But then what happens is, even in those TODs, you get 15% maybe of the trips are in transit, and what I keep flapping my wings about is, what are we going to do about the other 85% of the trips, right? If you have a light rail station right here, but 85% of the trips are generated from that development aren't there, we still have to build the roads to accommodate them. The good news is in Bellevue, my hometown now, is that the city's doing a remarkable job of building that road capacity. It's not getting any credit for carrying the lion's share of the trips from the new development, and it should. And it's also, that's one of the places where I think if we make that investment in it, whether it gets the credit or not, it's going to function really well. I hope that answered your question well.
Well, let me ask a follow-up if I may, and then I'm sure there'll be other questions because you were very sparing of your time. If the real estate industry is more aware than most of the importance of roads to their economic success, how would one tap into them support to get behind the kind of numbers that Dick's talking about, the concept of an initiative or some other mechanism that we decide is the way to put pressure on the legislature along the lines of what Senator Hobbs is suggesting? Well,
the question was, how can we tap into the real estate industry and to support the additional funding for maintenance and preservation as well as new capacity, and put pressure on the legislature? There are a couple of ways to do that. I've represented a couple of these big organizations, and they exist for their members' own interest, and making sure that these organizations continue to understand and increase their understanding and appreciation and functional transportation systems important, and focusing them on a data-driven solution rather than a political solution would help. They do have a lot of resources. That would be it. Another one, as I mentioned earlier, is the state exempted itself from concurrency. And the reason for that was valid back in the day. It's that you couldn't require a private development to pay impact fees to expand the capacity of state highways. It's just too expensive to do that, and then you have to fail the proportionality test the Constitution requires. But I think it's time to revisit that and just somehow create a greater obligation on the state to provide the capacity in the system the state's responsible for, just like we're trying to hold their feet to the fire for the responsibility of maintaining and preserving their existing trust assets. And these organizations look at that, not only be able to get to and from your jobs, we want to have housing that's more affordable, being able for the companies to attract employees to the commercial buildings, for the customers to make it to retail if we want to have our brick and mortar stores survive and succeed. I think different aspects of the real estate industry, whether it's property management or home sales or commercial development, all have a key stake in this. But for the most part, they've been supportive of additional transportation funding.
Ken, did you have a question?
Well, it was more of an aside, but Public Works trust fund, one of the partners in the funding of that was the real estate community. You know, and it was an agreed thing. They needed roads, and people needed a way to finance the roads that would help serve the development. So.
Yeah, and that was another diversion of funds was the real estate excise tax. You may know that there's a local option for that, and you know, a 1/4% for parks and a 1/4% for transportation. But that was all for capital. The point was, as you grow, you have these real estate transactions that provided capital to buy the land to do these things. But once those real estates, those developments were established, then you use general fund revenues to operate and maintain them. Well, the same problem where we have to maintain the roads is those local jurisdictions didn't put the money into it, and they said, well guys, now we want to use these REIT taxes that are intended for capital, like transportation capital, and use them just to do the basic function that we should have been more responsible about budgeting for. And so again, that was just yet another diversion of a tax increase from its intended purpose. And it's part of the challenge we have is maybe can we reel that back. Scott.
Todd, you said something earlier that I think was very prescient. You mentioned the Growth Management Act and that cities have not undertaken roadway maintenance and, of course, for GMA, roadway expansion projects to keep pace with growth. And I just spent a week in Singapore, which is an extremely dense city. They have a mass rapid transit system. And the only reason it works is because Singapore is something like 3 times denser than Seattle. And what I observed is that density is really expensive, because when you start to increase density, the cost of construction rises because, and I'm not saying like downtown Seattle building another high-rise, but just in general, because of the way that our culture views transportation, people tend to want a car. And in Bellevue, they need a car because you can't transform all of Bellevue into Singapore in the next 3 years and suddenly create this utopia. And so I think that the issue that we really face is that we are introducing land use in certain cities that is incongruent with the transportation network to begin with, isn't supported by these supposed mobility options that were being given by public transit agencies. But more to the point, we should be expanding the freeway system, and we should be expanding the roadway network to reduce congestion, because in theory, we have GMA to protect us from runaway sprawl. So, if GMA is there to limit the amount of sprawl that can occur, and ostensibly the GMA regulations were created to provide for the construction of adequate infrastructure, which includes roads, then there's no such thing as induced demand. So, I'm logically approaching this, and I know Bill and I have had some conversations about this over the past few years. Do these people want GMA, or do they not want GMA? And if they insist on constraining the housing market and increasing prices for everyone, and essentially, shooting poor families in the foot with their housing policies, then they should at least let us build the road so these people aren't stuck in traffic too.
Scott, part of the reason I made my comments brief is so Scott could have time to ask his question. And it's a really good one. Scott, let me answer it, because you really actually encapsulated the big issues in this, and I appreciate you bringing that to our attention. Those of us that were here during the GMA battles, and particularly the implementation when the counties wrote the countywide planning policies, may understand, remember that the fundamental issue that drove growth management, there was some sprawl certainly going on. Those horrible single-family neighborhoods that I was helping develop were considered awful by the people that lived in the previous phase that I had helped develop. But it was really about the local government's reluctance to invest in the new roads that were necessary to serve this growth. And the desire instead, particularly King County, for the investment into their transit system. King County had merged with Metro. They were getting out of the land use business. They could see the writing on the walls. Everybody was incorporating under GMA. So the big battle was, where do you put the urban growth boundary? Because you can't build urban infrastructure on the rural side of that. And I always remember my friend, the late Senator Alan Bluchel, said the intent of the legislature was that the urban growth boundary be somewhere east of North Bend, but it actually touches 405 in Renton and May Creek. So there wasn't enough capacity here. And the argument in favor of the GMA down in Olympia, when Governor Lowry was down there, was that it's cheaper to use existing infrastructure than build new infrastructure. And that's a true statement, but that wasn't the issue. The question is it cheaper to build new infrastructure in undeveloped areas, which we've done since the Denny's landed on Alki, as we've had these growth spurts, or do we have to build the infrastructure, retrofit the infrastructure in a built environment? And that's what Scott's identified. The only choice we have now is that we have to expand the infrastructure in a built environment, and it's very expensive to do that. But we have a legal requirement to do that under the Growth Management Act. The Growth Management Act, the legislature demonstrated quite a bit of wisdom, because we were debating whether or not we should grow. And that was the battles at almost every jurisdiction, whether it's in the county or the cities. But the legislature demonstrated the wisdom and said, you don't have a choice as to whether or not you take the growth, because the growth is coming. The choice you have is how you take the growth. And I'm optimistic, because it's taken us 25 years since we put these policies in place to really recognize and be honest about the fact that for the housing growth, that we now finally decide that we're going to have the zoned capacity to accommodate the growth and the demand for housing that we have. Better late than never, and it took us to a crisis point of housing affordability to get there. But it's a remarkable change in the tenor of the public debate about this. It's not, hardly anybody's saying we don't need any housing. But I used to be the lone voice in the room saying, guys, we've got to upzone this and have the capacity for the private sector to build it. I'm hoping that we're now almost at the point where we're reaching that crux on transportation where we say, we really have to accommodate the trip growth here. We know it's here. We've got a crisis. The congestion is growing double-digit percentages in terms of delay every year here in this region. And like Vic's identified, we can and have to do something about it. So, we're kind of maybe a little weary of fighting these fights for as long as we have, but I think that it's also right about that time when, this little spark, starts to catch fire, and people say, okay, we really do have to do something about it, and I'm willing to do what I wasn't willing to do in the past to make those kind of investments. So that's where I am in this. And the nice thing is we have adopted plans that would do just that. We don't have to go through the debates about what it is. We really just have to pull it together and support the funding necessary, not only to maintain and preserve things, but to expand it.
Okay, and we're going to, Bill, do you have a brief question?
Brief question, maybe I'll get a long answer.
I'll try and be brief.
You made the claim, I think, that we had data-driven solutions.
I wish we had data-driven solutions.
Oh, that was...
Yes. I'll leave you with this. My late dad said where we went wrong is we took the transportation planning out of the hands of the engineers and put it in the hands of the politicians. So I hope that we get it back into the engineers and use a data-driven approach with our elected officials, because they're certainly the key part of this. With that approach, I think we're going to have great success.
One of its management, mobility management areas, and its intersections that failed and survived in the year 2030 or so. How many intersections are going to fail in 2030 in Bellevue's forward-looking transportation plan? 37. 37. Fail. And yet we're permitting all this development. What's wrong with this picture? Where is growth management in this whole scheme of things?
Yeah, but that's a long conversation. I think that the simple answer is that, the simple answer, Bill, is that if we're going to allow the growth, the development, we must build the transportation infrastructure to solve it, and that's what we're calling for here.
But we're not identifying. We're not identifying how to fix those 37 intersections.
Again, we can have this conversation with Bob offline, but I think that overall, as we least we need to take the private sector approach and the public sector transportation infrastructure to maintain and preserve it. And then we also need to significantly increase the investments in capacity, and then figure out how we're going to take care of that too. Thank you.
Well, whereas I'd really like to ask Todd a couple questions about the constant demeaning of Cornell University on the Office television program, I think we'll move on instead to Bob talking to us about the centrality of good roads for retail trade and other traditional business structures. And I'd just like to say...
Yeah, thanks, Todd.
Thank you.